I'm Jonathan Larsen with TYTI Investigates, and for today's edition of TYTI Daily, I'm talking with senior writer from The Root, Michael Harriot, about a story that Mike and I collaborated on earlier this week about Pete Buttigieg and the South Bend Police Department, specifically about Black officers within the South Bend Police Department. And if folks haven't seen it already, we'll post a link in the description so you can go read it. Mike wrote the piece. We reported it jointly, but Mike is the author of the piece. And so I wanted to talk to him a little bit about his experience on this and his takeaways and all that. So, Mike, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks so much for working with me on this piece.
Yeah, thanks for putting up with me.
Sorry?
I said thanks for putting up with me for these few months.
Not at all. Not at all. I've been telling people I really enjoyed working with you, as well as getting to know you a little bit. Although we're, as you can tell from Skype, if you're watching, we're not anywhere near each other, so hopefully we'll get to meet someday. So I wanted to ask, it's a long piece, and I like that, but there's a lot in it. We talk a little bit about some of the reporting that I had done prior to our collaboration, and we also address some of the reporting, the new reporting that you and I both did for this story. And I'm wondering whether you had anything that constitutes a big headline for you. What's the big takeaway that was most important to you that you would like people to know as a matter of just the facts that we've brought to light here?
Well, I think the big headline is that for years, for his entire administration, officers in the South Bend Police Department complained repeatedly and constantly through multiple chiefs, through multiple administrations about racism in the police department. And it strains credulity to think that he never noticed this or heard these complaints, yet no one we could find in our months of research or investigation and interviews and of him even talking about the issue or addressing the issue. And that's the big headline.
And you had, I think it was you who sort of made this observation during the course of us working on this about who those Black officers were who stepped forward. It wasn't for the most part, and I should explain for people who haven't read the piece, when we say step forward, there were a series of letters sent to Buttigieg's office as well as other agencies signed by 10 Black officers. And I think it was you who made the observation of who those Black officers were. Could you break that out a little bit?
So the officers who spoke up were the most senior officers in the police department, the most senior Black officers, which is important because they repeatedly made the point that we could have gotten some of the rookies and newer guys to step up, and they had the same concerns that we had. But one, we didn't want to impose this thing on their career, and two, we wanted the leadership of South Bend to know that this isn't something that we just came up with last week. We want people to know that this is something that we have experienced over a period of years, and in some cases, decades.
And what was your sense of? I think primarily our focus. We didn't really deal with recruitment. We didn't focus too much on retention of Black officers, although that's obviously an issue. As we reported, a lot of most of the officers who came forward, they're gone now. But the thing we focused most on, and I think you actually did more of a deep dive on this than I did, was the promotions process. And when people think about racism in the police force, you and I talked about this a little bit, or racism generally, they tend to imagine something overt or openly sinister. I think you said something in your opening about it rarely comes wearing a suit and a tie. So what form in the promotions process did what form did racism take in the promotions process if it wasn't overt?
Okay, so it came in a few forms, right? So one of the things that happens a lot in corporate America, in almost any organization, is this kind of racism where this buddy system, we all know that it's not what you know, it's who you know, right? So a lot of times these white officers had connections and friends that were just because South Bend is essentially a small town. So the white people know the white people and black people know the black people. So when a lot of times when promotions would come and they would come up, the black officers would have no idea that these opportunities even existed. And sometimes even if they knew they existed, right, they held off because, for instance, there's this one case, right, with a guy, his name was Marcus Wright. He was already a lieutenant. He didn't even want to be really a promotion. What he wanted was what they called a lateral transfer. He was a lieutenant on the afternoon shift. They were hiring a lieutenant for the morning shift, and all the black officers knew he wanted it. So they didn't even apply. Well, so what the chief did is sent him through the process of essentially becoming a lieutenant again. And the process includes, and this is that other part that I was talking about, there's just a 3-man panel who interviews you. It's not a written test or anything. It's just an interview, and then they rank who they want to hire. Well, of course, if you are friends with the white officers, they're going to give the white officers a higher grade. So this guy lost this position to 3 guys who weren't even lieutenants. They had never done this position before, and he had been doing this position for 6 years, the exact same job for 6 years. But that wasn't the bad part, right? So this lieutenant position came open, and to their credit, the chief told them, hey, we're going to hire somebody for this new position. But what he didn't say is that he was going to hire 3 people. So when this position came open, the black officers say, hey, we're going to hold off and let Wright apply for this position. And none of the black officers applied. And not only did Wright not get the job, but 3 white officers got all 3 of those positions. And their excuse was, the black guy should have applied. I mean, we can't be discriminating if they didn't apply for the job. And those are the kinds of instances of racism. But you don't have a fair shot at promotion and equality in a police department.
So I always hate when people do this, when people think that when a reporter or a journalist shines a light on a problem, that they're obliged to say, well, what should have been done about it? But I'm going to ask that anyway, just in case you have any thoughts on what would a system look like that sort of has guardrails against that non-overt racism, just the sort of old boy, buddy cronyism that you'll find even in circumstances where race isn't an issue.
Well, see, this is my contention with Pete Buttigieg's, the entire Pete Buttigieg pushback on it, right? I don't think that Pete Buttigieg can fix racism, right? But this is with racism in any form, I always contend that if white people say something, it's less likely to persist, right? So if Pete Buttigieg, when he heard rumors of racist comments made on those secret police tapes, or when he heard about these EEOC complaints, or when he saw these 5 lawsuits, or when he got that first letter, or the second letter, or the third letter, or the 4th email, right? If at any point he would have just gathered the police department together and said, look, I've been hearing about these instances of racism, and we're not going to tolerate it. He didn't have to specifically put a policy in place. Policies are good, right? But if a person is around a group that he knows will condemn their actions, in this case, racist actions, they're less likely to do it. So the sergeants and the chiefs are less likely to let this problem persist and are more likely to say, look, we'll find a way internally to do something, right? They're more likely to do that if anyone, especially the leadership like Pete Buttigieg, if he speaks up and just says, I won't tolerate. The thing is, he didn't say anything. And so the only conclusion that the black officers could reach was that Pete Buttigieg approves of this.
So the remedy you're talking about, it's interesting because you're not really addressing sort of the primary asset that he kind of brings to the table as a candidate, which is, you know, I'm a big tech, big data administrator type. You're suggesting, it sounds like, that he really needed to, if not also do that other stuff, but at a minimum, sort of step up and embody that big leadership role and just say, this is how things are going to be.
So yeah, that's an interesting question, right? So and I always talk about this, right? So when you talk about policies, anti-discrimination policies, diversity policies, those things are necessary and they are great, right? But when you put those in place, it is also necessary to address the issue head on, because if you put those diversity policies and those anti-discrimination policies in place, but don't address the people who are making those complaints, it still makes them feel as if they haven't been heard, right? So if like these officers wrote multiple letters saying, hey, look, we won't get promotions. If Pete Buttigieg, you know, put those diversity policies in place, and then let's say he convened a meeting with the black officers or the entire police department and say, look, I've been hearing these complaints and this is what we're going to do, those officers would have at least felt a little better. But they repeatedly wrote these letters saying, hey, listen to us. And the only reason that they did that is because no one even spoke to them about their concerns.
And as I told you, I was very annoyed with you for being a better writer than I am. And you started off the piece with a really, I thought, interesting and thought-provoking observation about sort of a personality framework. There's this, I guess, this litmus test or Rorschach kind of thing in psychology, not a real one, I guess you said, but you said something like it's a framework of assessing personalities based on whether they would prefer the power to fly or to be invisible. And it was a provocative way to start the piece. And I wanted to ask you if you could connect it more explicitly to, not that you didn't in the story, but just sort of be explicit about what your thinking was about why to start off that way and connect it to the reporting that we did.
Because the reason I chose that kind of analogy is because that is when you're in a big organization or a corporate environment, a lot of times Black people feel that way, right? If you're not getting a promotion at your job when you know you're just as good as the person next to you who's white, but he, you know, plays golf with the boss on the weekend, you feel invisible, you feel unheard, you feel as if your work doesn't matter, right? And so it's not just unique to South Bend, but it's a situation that a lot of people who exist in white spaces feel. And so I wanted to use that analogy to point out there, like, and the other reason was, like, Pete Buttigieg acted as if they were invisible, right? Like his office stamped these letters as received. They sent them to his email. They told the board of public safety. They told the common council. They reached out literally to every resource in the city, the state, the county. They did everything that they could. They filed EEOC complaints. They even finally went to the U.S. attorney. They filed lawsuits, and no one ever spoke about this issue. It's almost impossible to believe, like, as if, you know, I thought, you know, it's part of what I did was I thought to myself, well, I gotta find someone who knows or who can tell me about Pete Buttigieg speaking to them about this issue. But I literally couldn't find a single person who said, Pete Buttigieg talked to me about the racism in the police department.
We do know about at least 2 Black people in the community, neither of them cops, who reported having face-to-face conversations with Buttigieg. We've reported on both of them. There was Stephanie Jones, whose son was found hanged. And we know from the minutes of a meeting in 2012 that she told her story at a meeting where he was there. And she told us that she approached him afterward, asked him for help, and he ghosted her. And then there's Reverend Brown, who said at the council meeting that he went to one of the mayor's events and brought the Teachman incident to his attention before anyone knew about it, and essentially got no love from the mayor. And that's why it became a bigger issue, precisely because he didn't feel heard by the mayor. So I wanted to ask you about your own Pete Buttigieg path, because obviously you sort of you, I guess, went viral, as the kids say, with your piece. I forget whether it was late November, early December, called "Pete Buttigieg is a Lying MF," about his education policies and things that he had to say about education. So I was wondering if I could sort of archaeologize your Pete Buttigieg path a little bit and ask you when he first sort of got on your radar, and what your Pete Buttigieg path has been like in terms of whether it's evolved or changed your assessment of him going forward from that point. So if you could start at the beginning and then walk me through, I'd be curious to hear.
So, there are a lot of people who, contend or accuse me of being obsessed with Pete Buttigieg. So it's interesting that you asked that question, right? So the first time I, had any interaction with really the Pete Buttigieg issue was months ago, like right when he first started his campaign. And someone who worked with Pete Buttigieg in South Bend emailed me and said, hey, you're gonna, if you look in the right places, you're gonna find a lot of racism in Pete Buttigieg's administration. Well, I looked and I didn't find anything. So I put it aside. I didn't do it anymore. And then someone sent me a video of Pete Buttigieg, the infamous video of him saying that Black people need more role models, and that's why, education in inner cities and poor communities suffers. And so I didn't even plan to write anything. I sent it to our editors, and it was the end of the day, and I said, well, has anyone done anything with this? Nobody had done anything with it. So I wrote that piece, Pete Buttigieg is a Lying MF. And after that piece went by, like, he called me. His people called me and said, do with Pete Buttigieg. Well, anyone who knows me and knows my writing, like, I'm willing to talk to anyone. I don't write and hide behind the keyboard. I wish I could say some of the stuff that I write to people's face. So I said, yeah. And so he called me, we had a conversation. And of course, like you and I know, and most people in media know, like, he did that so that I would write about it again. And of course, I couldn't do that without writing about it again. So I wrote about it again. And then he called me again and asked if I would like to have an on-camera interview with him, to interview him on camera. And I said, yeah, right. So because, and some of the backstory to that is The Root has done in-depth on-camera interviews with every presidential candidate. And Pete Buttigieg was just one of the few people who we hadn't gotten to yet. So I said, yeah. So we did that, and it was done. And then people started sending me this information about the police department. And, when I first got the email, I said, well, yeah, sure, send me the information. And I didn't think anything about it. And then he sent me the documents. And it was like a few days before I even looked at the documents to see what was there. And it was really stunning to me, which set me on the path to, like, my process is that when someone tells me, hey, I have this interesting story to tell you, my process as a journalist is I'm going to disprove their story, right? That's how you get the facts, right? Like, I have, years worth of letters from Pete Buttigieg, to Pete Buttigieg saying there's racism in your police department and you're not doing anything. So all I have to do is disprove what they're saying by showing when Pete Buttigieg addressed racism in his police department. After months of research, I couldn't find anything. And not only couldn't I find anything, everyone I talked to said he ignored it. So that was the backstory to that piece. as a journalist, you cover the things that you think are important and the things that impact people. And this is just one of the things that just kept landing in my lap. But you know, as far as my assessment of Pete Buttigieg, and this might sound harsh, right? But when I wrote the first thing about Pete Buttigieg, I didn't dislike Pete Buttigieg. And now, you know, after all of this information, I don't dislike Pete Buttigieg, right? I think it is hard, sounds harsh. Pete Buttigieg is just a white man, right? He is going to do what men like him do. Like, you can't be this close to becoming president without having a little throat slitting in your persona, right? You got to be a little bit ruthless. You got to be able to do things, if only for political expediency. And that's what, you know, Pete Buttigieg does. Like, you can't be a presidential contender without having this, because if you face those tough issues, you're going to get criticism, and that takes you out of the running, right? And so I don't feel any way about Pete Buttigieg that I feel about Joe Biden, or, you know, Amy Klobuchar, or, you know, I've written some of the same things about Pete Buttigieg, about Kamala Harris that I wrote about Pete Buttigieg. I've written some of the same things about Joe Biden, you know. So it's not that I am anti-Pete Buttigieg. You know, you go to where the truth leads you, and if it's bad, it's bad. If it's good, it's good.
And I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand that the way journalism works is that it's not necessarily that you're obsessed with someone, but when you do one story and it gets attention, that tends to open up avenues that weren't open before, and that makes a lot more sense to pursue those avenues than to try to generate an entirely new story about something that you know nothing about. You've now made an investment in this issue, and it's going to continue to pay dividends as long as there's something there.
And also, you know this, right? When you're doing a story like this, there are 20 more stories that pop up that you can't even address, right? Like, you know, there's the issue with police brutality in South Bend that we didn't even get to. There's the issue of, like, this woman whose son, who found her son hanged, and she begged Pete Buttigieg to look. And we can see other issues that you get to address because, but you're led to them by this one story.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you. You talked about sort of political ruthlessness, and I'm pretty sure I understand your point there, but where there's a little bit of a disconnect for me there is that it seems to me that let's assume sort of the most cynical scenario. Pete Buttigieg was motivated by nothing more than political expediency and ambition. Wouldn't the politically smart thing to do be not to ignore almost half of the Black constituency of your police force when they say there's racism in your police force? Wouldn't the politically smart thing to do, regardless of the goodness of your heart, just as a matter of being a ruthless politician, wouldn't the smart thing to do be to say, I am going to jump on this, and I'm going to turn this into an opportunity to be the good guy and the savior and the political hero? Like, wouldn't that have been the way to go?
That's a good question, right? But here's the answer. Not if Black people weren't invisible, right? You just think about this, right? And I think about this. Of, like, this guy is like one of the front runners for the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party, right? And of all the journalists in the world, right, there's like 2 people who have done this story, right? And so if you and I hadn't done it, like, he would have gotten away with it. So the answer is no. The politically expedient thing to do for you, if you didn't care about it, is to ignore it. Because but for 2 people, this story would have never come to light. And we still don't know if anybody will care enough about about this story to, like, cancel Pete Buttigieg or reject him as a candidate, because we know most of his voters, his supporters are white. So, you know, if let's say he gets support from a million other Pete Buttigiegs, then he could be president. So I mean, it sounds cynical and bad to say, but if you were a ruthless person who really cared about advancing politically, you wouldn't address the racism in your police department. The only reason to address it is if you actually cared.
About 11 different things you said there on their own broke my heart during that minute and a half or whatever it was. Uh, so let's I want to see if you saw any parallels, I guess, between the work you did on his education stuff and now the focus on the police stuff. The big takeaway, there were two takeaways I would say from your education piece. One was the substance of getting the education policy and the underlying facts about how education works and doesn't work in relation to poverty and economics. The other, of course, was the headline about his honesty. And you and I both know, I think, in political journalism circles, people care a lot more about the honesty than they do about education policy and poverty and race. And so on the honesty thing, at least, is there a theme there? Do you I don't want to force a parallel if there weren't any, but did you see similar things in the law enforcement silo that you saw in the education silo?
Yeah, you know, one thing that one of the parallels is that Pete Buttigieg, as far as education, right, and like the worry that I had when I saw that clip of him talking about education in inner cities, right, is that, hey man, this guy could possibly get into the room, you know, in those rooms of power with all white people and just, perpetuate this narrative, act as it, because he knows, right? And he knows about why education is disparate in Black communities. But when he gets into that room filled with people of power, right, it's about the model, right? And that is the point that I was making with that education piece, right? Well, now you kind of know it's true, right? Because when he was in these rooms of power, even if it was just the little pedestal of power that South Bend offers, right? He knew about the racism in his police department, right? And did nothing about it. Just as I feared he would when I saw that education clip, right? And so that's one thing. And as to honesty, right? I disagree with you in that people expect honesty. I kind of think we kind of know.
Oh, I didn't mean to suggest that.
Right. So I think what it shows, right, is a concerted effort to concoct this thing of plausible deniability, right? I've never heard the tapes, therefore I can't, do anything about the racist language on the tape. When everybody, me, you, the people in South Bend, the people in his police department, all of the people in his administration, his chief of staff, I also like to point out that the city of South Bend and the police department weren't being sued about these tapes. It was Pete Buttigieg. It was a lawsuit against Pete Buttigieg. And it was his lawyers that deposed Karen DePape. It was his lawyers that deposed Boykin. And so we would have to believe that he hired lawyers. They heard about this discrimination on the tape, that his chief of staff was lying when he said, I briefly told him about the derogatory language. We'd have to believe that Pete Buttigieg didn't hear any of that and that his lawyers never told him about the broad strokes of what was heard on the tapes. This is how I always explain it, right? So my son is obsessed with Star Wars, you know, and I grew up in an era where everybody had seen Star Wars, right? I've never seen a Star Wars movie. Yeah, I hope you don't, you know, hang up on me because I say that, right? But I know who Luke Skywalker is. I know that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's dad. I know what a Jedi is. You know, I don't have to watch the movie to know what happened, right? You know, the broad strokes. And if someone like burst into my home right now and attacked me with a lightsaber, I know what the lightsaber, or someone said grab the lightsaber, I know what the lightsaber is, right? So, you know, it's just impossible to believe that. I honestly do believe that Pete Buttigieg has never listened to those tapes. But there is no way that I can believe that he doesn't know what's on the tape. And those are two different things, right? And that's what I wanted to point out.
Yeah, and well, that all makes sense, and I will say that I'm certainly not aware of anything to indicate that he has heard the tapes. But as you referred, we do know that he has said public, I want to know what's on the tapes, but I don't even know if legally I can ask. He said that years after, his lawyers already had asked explicitly in those interrogatories you were referring to. They did ask and they got answers.
You should also point out that the city of South Bend and Pete Buttigieg are, you know, have for years been paying lawyers to not let us know what's on those tapes, to keep those tapes private, right? Like those.
Well, the city's actually no longer a party to that suit, right. but it certainly was true for a while. Right. And now the cops themselves are the ones blocking their release.
Right. And the other thing is that when it comes to Pete Buttigieg and like this plausible deniability, I think it's important to say that he, like, him having heard the tapes is not important, right? Because you could just go to your police department and say, I've heard that there is discrimination in this police department. You don't have to know where I heard it from, right? You could just go to them and address the issue without saying it's because of the tapes that I'm talking to you. So like, and one of the things is he's pushing back on is this, like, he's going into the weeds about these tapes when the tapes aren't really a big issue. It's a symptom of the problem and not the problem. It's not my nose isn't running. You know, if you have the germ of racism inside you, it doesn't matter if you're sniffling.
So I don't think you and I ever talked about this, but the first time I went to South Bend back in April, it was very clear to me that the tapes were they were not going to be accessed in any way, shape, or form. I had no hope of it. But to your point, the first thing that crossed my mind was, I don't need the tapes to address the underlying issue. The tapes matter if they reveal X being racism in the police force. There are 1,000 other ways you can find out whether X is there or not. And I did that. I spoke to people in law enforcement. I spoke to criminals. I spoke to any number of people, Black, white, Republican, Democratic, within the police department, veterans of the police department, in other law enforcement capacities, public officials. The article was long. It was a long article. It's right there. And it took me a week and I had no prior connections in South Bend. So the thing that's been a little crazy making for me, and now I'm going to vent a little bit, is this notion that it's almost like, it's true there is judicial language that says you cannot reveal what is on the tapes. That has been interpreted by a lot of people in the maximalist sense of you can't talk about anything that happens to have been mentioned on the tapes. So if one of the cops says, I love apples, everyone in town, not everyone in town, but like the official fig leaf is, I'm not allowed to talk about apples. Yeah, actually you are. You are allowed to talk about apples.
Yeah,
so anyway, go ahead.
And the other thing is, right, like he selectively chooses what things on the tape, like he can't talk about. If you ask him if donors were responsible for getting rid of Boykins, he will pointedly say, I've asked the donors and they say they weren't involved. People have asked the donors if they were involved in getting rid of Boykins, and they weren't involved. Well, that the only reason we know that is because it is allegedly on the tapes. But if you ask him about the racism on the tape, oh, I can't talk about it, right? So
well, he hasn't publicly talked about the donors either. I'd love to ask him, but I haven't called him a lying MF, and he won't talk to me, at least not yet, anyway.
Well, he pointed out to me, his campaign pointed out to me that, like, I'd never mentioned that there were 2 donors who were accused of plotting to get rid of Boykins. He pointed that out to me, which is only revealed on the tape, not mentioned in our article, but he says the 2 donors, they denied it. And I'm like, but yeah, we didn't mention 2 donors, bro.
Well, it was interesting to me when you told me that, because the 2 donors denied that to me in my earlier reporting when I talked about the documents which describe what's on the tapes. And the Buttigieg campaign has never acknowledged publicly whether or not, they've never said that Larsen's reporting is true or not true. But now it turns out they're apparently citing my reporting, which also would seem to indicate that they also think the documents are genuine. And if you think the documents are genuine enough to use that as part of your communications with a reporter, why wouldn't you say publicly to the world, these documents are genuine, I'm the leader of this city, which he was at the time, and here's what I think about it and what we need to do about it. And there's been silence on that.
Right. And the other thing, part about that is, like, he doesn't have to address the documents, right? Like Karen DePape is giving public interviews. You can just comment on what she said publicly. You can just comment on what Boykins has said publicly. You can just comment on these public lawsuits. You can just comment on the EEOC complaints. You could just comment on these letters that were presented to the city council or the Board of Public Safety. You can comment on the president of the Board of Public Safety quitting in front of the media. Like, there are so many ways to address these issues without even addressing the specifics of what's on the tapes.
So one of the things that, I don't want to go down the hole of responding to a thing I saw on Twitter, but I get this often enough that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. The idea is when I've reported jointly with you and earlier, when I've reported on things like, his response to indications of racism in the city, in the police, when it seems apparent to readers that we're saying he did not respond in an ideal way, the pushback I often get is, you're trying to prove that he's racist. And I don't think I'm trying to prove that he's racist, and you and I have had conversations around this topic before, but I'm guessing that you get a similar thing, this idea that all of the facts that we're reporting, our only interest in those facts is not that the facts themselves are problematic, but that they are proof of what he is, right? His essence is racist. And I'm going to shut up now, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on all that.
Okay, so, as someone who covers race, I think part of the reason for that is, like, people don't understand what racism is. And, like, really, I pull back in the article, because what we're really talking about, right, is not racism, it's white supremacy. But people don't understand what that word means, and it's such an alarmist word that, we said discrimination, we said racism, but what we're really talking about is white supremacy. The white people who were officers in South Bend had a better chance, or they were superior to the black officers in that little space of the organization of the South Bend Police Department. That's white supremacy, right? So people don't understand what that is. And the other point is that when you talk about racism or white supremacy or discrimination, right, I don't think, and I'd have to, like, go back and listen to the recordings of the interviews and look through the notes, but I don't think, like, even in the letters, they say Pete Buttigieg is racist. They say there is racism in this police department that Pete Buttigieg is ignoring, right? But I would contend that if you ignore racism, you're committing an act of racism, right? Like if you know that there are people who are suffering disproportionately in any area that you have power over, and you can stop it, but you know about it and continue to let them suffer, then you're part of the reason for their suffering. And so, and the last thing I would say is that let's not even call it racism or white supremacy. Let's just imagine that it was something else, right? Let's imagine that it was like cops stealing or cops doing something illegal. The thing is that he had a rampant problem in his police department, regardless of whether it was racism or, let's say, officers not wearing their badge. He had a rampant problem in his police department that he knew about, people were telling him about, and he did not address, right? So part of it goes to leadership, right? And like the political expediency of ignoring a problem just because it's hard to solve.
Well, I will say in his book, he says something like, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like, I inherited a department where cliquishness and, there were rumors of cliquishness and things like that. And during the week I was there in April, I heard rumors of a lot worse than that. And as you say, it was not limited to issues of race. There were issues of corruption and, there were, let's just say there was not a lot of faith in internal affairs at the time.
Right.
So yeah, there were certainly issues that went beyond it. And while we're on the topic, I want to, before we close, and I thank you for your time. But before we close, it was a long piece, and I think people sort of assume, wow, this is exhaustive. And I've got a list of things that I wish we could have included. But I wanted to hear, what's sort of the top of your list of things that, man, I would have loved to have gotten that in there.
Yeah, part of our process of when we finally finished kind of reporting the story and started writing the report story, like half of the process was like, come on, man, we just can't put that in there, or we can't put this in there. Like, it's just too much of a rabbit hole, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
Right.
In other words, some things that required a lot of explanation.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
I see what you mean.
And the piece was 5,000 words. So there's stuff you can't leave out. We were still cutting stuff the last minutes before it went out. So here's one of the most interesting things that maybe the leadership, the chiefs that he selected as chiefs were much more ill-equipped and less qualified than the black officers who were already in the department, right? There were black officers with spotless records in the South Bend Police Department, right? So when he got rid of Boykins, let's say he got rid of Boykins on legitimate grounds, right? He selected a guy who had already been accused of racism. He selected a guy who was already accused of corruption. He selected a guy who was being accused at the day he selected him of ignoring the death of a black person, right? That's who he chose for his interim chief. And then when he chose his permanent chief, Teachman, he selected a guy who has already been accused of corruption. He had selected a guy who has already been accused of racism. He had selected a guy who wasn't even working as a police officer at the time, right? And then when Teachman left, he selected a guy, Ruskowski was promoted, selected, however you want to call it, who was already in charge of that department that was already being accused of racism, right? And that's the point, right? Not like we could talk about him ignoring it, but we never got to kind of how he perpetuated this problem by putting people in charge who it was proven would ignore racism in police departments. So that's part of the reason that there was racism in his police department.
All right. Well, anything else before we say goodbye?
I think I've said enough.
I think I don't know. I saw a lot of response to your piece online that people are hungry for you to have more to say. And speaking for myself, anyway, you know, I'm still working on this stuff. So we'll see what. And we're what, a month out from Iowa or something like that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to the political dialogue and the race as things get closer to the wire. So. Mike Harriot, senior writer with The Root, thanks so much for joining us here today on TYTI Daily, and thanks so much for collaborating with me on the piece and the fantastic job writing it. It was a really fun process. I enjoyed it, and I'm glad I got a chance to know you. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for like holding my hand and walking me through like these months of investigative reporting that you've been doing. Like I'm still learning stuff that you've already reported. So.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and if nothing else, I appreciate having there be now two guys. So I appreciate very much having at least that audience of one. So thank you, and thanks for the work you did to advance the story and come up with new stuff that I wasn't aware of. And folks, if you're new to this webcast, we're TYTI Daily, and I hope you'll subscribe to our channel on YouTube, TYT Investigates, like and follow us on Facebook, all that good stuff, and take care of each other, take care of yourselves. Bye now.